Greetings, traveller from beyond the fog. I am Melina.
You're watching VGC's review of Elden Ring for the PlayStation 5. The footage in this video is captured from early areas and contains no spoilers.
I offer you an accord.
We wish that we had a year to review Elden Ring. Not because we needed that time to beat a particular boss, and not because it was so mentally taxing that we could only play it for a short period of time, but because the game feels so incredibly massive and dense with mystery that it feels like we'll only get a true sense of the magic of Elden Ring after the game has been out for a long time. Taking the Souls formula and applying it to an open world would have been one thing, and frankly, if that's all that Elden Ring was, it would probably be warmly received by fans. However, for a game that has carried expectation in a way that few titles can approach, we'd hoped Elden Ring would try to be something more. To be the new gold standard for games in the genre and the largest paradigm shift for modern action games since Demon's Souls landed over a decade ago. And while it doesn't quite reach those expectations, it's still an absolutely incredible experience with a few minor issues that'll be far in the background while you spend the next 6 months of your life exploring the lands between. When Demon's Souls was first released, the community that sprung up around that game was one that was desperate to discover every last secret. It was something entirely new, and while online communities for games like this had existed before, there was a momentum and a scale to the early Souls community that contributed massively to the popularity of the series today. If, like us, you imported a PS3 copy of Demon's Souls from the US, it was an adventure into the unknown. Elden Ring recaptures that sense of possibility in a way that no game in the series has since. When you enter the lands between, you'll be greeted with such a large landscape that it doesn't feel like you're playing a Souls game anymore. While the interconnected nature of the Souls maps have always been an element, it was a common thing to see a castle in the distance and know that eventually you'll get to fight something in there. It's nothing compared to how genuinely overwhelming it can feel to explore in Elden Ring. While the game will initially hold your hand and guide you in the right direction, after a few hours you'll have to make your own way. There are a few NPCs that'll tell you generally where to go, but your best approach is literally to find some high ground, look for something that seems interesting or more likely menacing, and head in that direction. The Souls games are perhaps best known above anything else for their intense difficulty. While it can be argued that the games have always had ways to circumvent this, whether it was grinding for souls by repeating the same area over and over, or relying on certain weapons and playstyles that will ease the challenge, the skill that the Souls games demand is an element of what has made it so popular in an era of basic hand-holding games. Elden Ring, while often still extremely difficult, offers an interesting balance that's entirely new to the series. Since it's an open world game and fairly quickly you can head in whichever direction you choose, there's a non-linearity to how you encounter the world and its bosses. While there are some bosses that you have to complete for story progression, there has never been so many sub and hidden bosses in a Souls game before. This presents a bit of a problem. With the very little guidance the game gives you in regarding to where you should go next, we occasionally found ourselves smashing our heads against a wall of bosses we were clearly underleveled for. Similarly, by doing a lot of exploring, we found ourselves reaching story-critical moments that were supposed to pose a huge threat, only for them to be felled in a few shots thanks to the inadvertent grinding we happened to do on our travels. The natural cadence of the old games, where every boss you encounter would be an evolved challenge from the previous one, is somewhat lost. You'll also find yourself feeling as though you're heading down the main path, only to realise you've just spent half a day on an optional boss, your only reward being a weapon that's worse than the one you came in with. The boss fights in these games can be nothing short of magical, and Elden Ring absolutely delivers. We found ourselves loudly swearing just as much at the amazing set pieces and locations that fights take you to as we did at the perfection that most bosses demand. There is so much to this game and the bosses that hasn't been seen yet, and while the bosses are incredible to look at and there's literally nothing in games quite like the feeling of taking one down, they aren't without issue. There are still plenty of times where a boss will kill you in one hit with an attack that's so impossible to predict that it feels nothing but cheap. We'd really wish that by now those types of encounters would have been ironed out, but it's common enough to be a bit of a frustration. As mentioned previously, you can always leave the fights and venture into the wider world to level up before returning, but even then it feels like you're beating the boss by force rather than skill, which isn't all that fun when compared to the boss fights in the game that feel tactical almost in a Sekiro-like way. This isn't an issue of getting good, it's nothing but a disappointment when an extremely challenging fight, which is the best part of these games, turns on its head and there's nothing you could have done about it. When a boss beats us, we want it to be because we've yet to master the mechanics of that fight, not because a beam from absolutely nowhere drained all of our health without warning. The story in Souls games has often been criticised for how obtuse it can be, with important pieces of lore hidden in item descriptions and in areas that no one would realistically look. On the other hand, plenty of players love this approach to storytelling, where everything you pick up can add some element of clarity to a massive unknown world. And what is one of the best decisions in Elden Ring, it's significantly less secretive about telling you what's actually going on. While that can occasionally feel like being waterboarded with exposition, it's really crucial in a game of this size. We're not in the era of Demon Souls levels being linear affairs with a few offshoots. There are optional forts in Elden Ring that dwarf Castle Boletaria. It's a massive game. Elden Ring essentially follows the player, the Tarnished, who is tasked with uniting pieces of the Elden Ring in order to take a character to the Erd Tree, that massive golden obelisk that stands above the entire world. Each rune is held by a major boss, which is how the game handles progression. The narrative is certainly interesting, although it does sometimes trip up on itself when trying to explain the bigger concepts of the world. The smaller stories, like those involving NPCs that are hidden away in corners that few would look, are often stronger because they feel self-contained and don't require a glossary of terms to feel like you know what's going on. Elden Ring's art style feels like a team that has been wrestling with 6 games worth of inspiration and moulding it into one open world. It's vast, colourful and breathtaking, but at the same time it can be dark, disgusting and eerie. Veterans of the series will find themselves walking down a street thinking, "This feels like Bloodborne," or scaling castle ramparts and being reminded of the first time they encountered the series, be that demons or Dark Souls. Enemies too are incredibly detailed. It's a shame that you can only really get a good look at them once you've defeated them because there's so much cool armour that we wish we could have gotten a look at. It's likely that these armour sets exist somewhere in the game for a player to wear, but considering the sheer landmass of the map, it'll be some time before there's a complete list of all the fantastic outfits and where to find them. This is arguably the 5th or 6th time that From are making a game on modern hardware that's inspired by fairly similar high fantasy origins, so it's very impressive that while plenty of the areas are reminiscent of old games, it never feels like a retread. Boss fights also manage to feel fresh while leaving room for a few sub-bosses that are very clearly references to the Hall of Fame of Souls bosses. It's a hugely celebratory game that feels like a gift to fans who've been with the series since the utterly impenetrable roots. While the art direction and style of the game is unimpeachable, graphically Elden Ring can often look a bit dated. This isn't helped by the visually incredible Demon Souls remake on the PlayStation 5, but there are plenty of muddy textures throughout the world. Faces and skin generally have always looked a bit strange in Souls games, and Elden Ring is no exception. On PlayStation 5 we also encountered some minor performance issues, with stuttering occurring when the open world was attempting to load in some grass textures or other minor bits of decoration. The game offers 2 modes, one that prioritises frame rate and another that prioritises resolution. We stuck with the frame rate options throughout, and while the game still looks good, especially with the overwhelming amount of colour that's being used, it looks closer to something like Dark Souls 3 than the Demon Souls remake. This doesn't really matter in the bigger picture, and if you're concentrating on a boss fight, you'll hardly notice it. In the quiet moments or taking a breather between the intense action is something we picked up on. Elden Ring is a ridiculously long game. This will obviously vary if you happen to be the greatest Souls player to ever live, but there's genuinely so much to do that a player could spend 50 hours in the opening few areas, only for the map to expand once again full to the brim with new stuff to do. We've played so much of this game and we know there's probably just as much that we didn't get to see. That is incredibly exciting. That's not even counting the countless mini dungeons that are scattered throughout the map or the rematches with past bosses that you'll find on your way towards the end of the game. Rarely after a review do we feel so inclined to continue exploring a game to its absolute fullest, but with Elden Ring there's no way to know what the fullest actually entails. There are things in the distance that we don't know how to reach. There are probably hundreds of secrets that will take a community full of players to actually uncover. It's a sense of adventure that is so rare in games, and one that we can't recommend highly enough. Elden Ring is a fantastic game that can still deliver the unmatched thrill of defeating a tough boss after an hours long battle. Those who worship at the Church of Souls-likes will find a game that's basically everything they ever wanted. There are more bosses than ever, more areas to explore, and so much lore to find that the digital archaeologists of the Souls community will be kept busy for years. While minor technical issues and some dated graphics occasionally crop up, the art direction and world of Elden Ring is an absolute spectacle. It's a very hard game, but it's one that affords you the chance to turn around, go off on an adventure, and come back later. And while it isn't the revolution that Demon's Souls was all those years ago, it's the closest that FromSoftware have come to recapturing that magic after all this time. We give Elden Ring 5 out of 5.